Imagine waking up one morning to find that your name, your face, has become the stuff of nightmares. That across an entire kingdom, people whisper that you're not human, that you lie with beasts, that you summon demons under the moonlight, that your very touch is cursed. This wasn't the plot of a medieval horror story. It was real life for Isabella of France. A teenage queen, married off for politics, trapped in a foreign court that despised her, and then turned her into a monster. They called her the she-wolf of France. But what if that name, the one history branded her with, wasn't a symbol of evil, but of revenge? This is not a fairy tale about love and betrayal. This is about propaganda, power, and survival. It's about a 13-year-old girl who arrived in England as a pawn and left as the most feared woman in Europe. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the darkest smear campaigns ever recorded. The story of how a queen became a myth, how lies became weapons, and how a woman turned humiliation into empire-level vengeance. Because when the world tried to burn Isabella of France, she didn't hide. She learned how to set the fire herself. Pause. So before you judge the so-called she-wolf, ask yourself, if history called you a beast, would you spend your life proving them wrong or proving them right? In the winter of 1308, a French carriage rolled through the cold mist of northern England. Inside sat a girl barely 13, wrapped in furs too heavy for her small shoulders. Her name was Isabella of France, daughter of one of the most powerful kings in Europe, and by the time the sun set, she would become Queen of England. But this was not a love story. It was a political transaction sealed in parchment and wax, a marriage meant to weld two crowns together. She was not a bride. She was an offering. Her father, Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, ruled France like a chessboard. Every move was cold, deliberate, calculated for advantage. He crushed the Knights Templar, imprisoned the Pope, and bent the church itself to his will. Beauty and fairness had nothing to do with his soul, only power did. To him, Isabella was a living treaty, a breathing alliance. When he sent her to England to marry King Edward II, he believed he was securing France's future. He never imagined he was sending his daughter into the heart of humiliation. Edward was not the king people expected. His father, Edward I, had been a conqueror, tall, fierce, the hammer of the Scots. But his son had no taste for war or blood. He preferred music to battlefields, friendship to conquest, beauty to brutality. In another time, perhaps he would have been loved for his gentleness. In the 13th century, it was a curse. And when Isabella arrived in England, she found that her new husband's heart already belonged to someone else. Piers Gaveston, the name whispered like scandal through every hall. A young nobleman from Gascony, clever, charming, arrogant beyond measure. He was Edward's closest companion, his favorite, his shadow. The king gave him everything, lands, jewels, and influence that eclipsed the queen herself. It was said that even at Isabella's wedding, when the torches flickered and the lords raised their goblets to toast the royal couple, Edward could not take his eyes off Gaveston. In front of the entire court, he handed him the wedding gifts, gold, crowns, jewels, and called him his brother. Isabella stood silent, smiling for the crowd, her heart turning to ice. That night, she understood something that most queens never dared admit. Love in a royal marriage was irrelevant, but respect was essential. And she had neither. She was surrounded by strangers, in a land that did not welcome her, married to a man who looked at another with the kind of tenderness she would never receive. But silence does not mean surrender. Even at 13, Isabella had inherited her father's steel. She studied everything. The faces of the nobles, their alliances, their rivalries. She learned the language, memorized the names of every powerful house, and watched for cracks in the foundation of the English court. If she could not be loved, she would learn to be feared. Years passed. Gaveston grew bolder, flaunting his power, mocking the English lords, wearing the king's jewels as if they were his own. The nobles seethed. In 1312, they finally snapped. A coalition led by Thomas of Lancaster seized Gaveston and executed him without the king's permission. Edward collapsed in grief. His court descended into chaos. And Isabella, standing beside him, pretended to mourn while she quietly breathed again. Without Gaveston, she believed, perhaps she could finally be queen. But history rarely repeats kindness. In the vacuum Gaveston left behind stepped another man, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Where Gaveston was reckless, Despenser was disciplined. Where Gaveston was vain, Despenser was cruel. He didn't seek the king's affection, he sought control. And he saw Isabella for exactly what she was, a threat. He began by isolating her. Servants were dismissed, letters censored, her income restricted. Every gesture, every visit, every conversation was twisted into suspicion. Despenser's weapon wasn't a sword. It was words. At first the rumors were soft, the kind of whispers that make people raise eyebrows, but not questions. The queen keeps strange hours. She spends too much time with her priests. She rides out alone after dusk. But in a medieval court, rumor was wildfire, and all it needed was oxygen. By 1315, that fire had become an inferno. The tales grew darker, uglier, unthinkable. They said the queen practiced pagan rituals, that she had made pacts with demons, that she found comfort not in men, but in beasts. Bestiality, the most depraved accusation the medieval mind could imagine. A sin not of weakness, but of monstrosity. It turned Isabella from a queen into something inhuman, something that could be hated without guilt. The brilliance of the campaign lay in its cruelty. A woman could not defend herself without proving her accusers right. If she spoke, she was angry, proof of her wickedness. If she stayed silent, her silence was taken as guilt. Despenser knew that every whisper, every painted story, would sink deep into the minds of nobles and priests alike. By the time anyone questioned it, the damage would already be done. And yet, Isabella did not crumble. She played the role of the wronged wife, calm and cold, while quietly keeping track of every name that had repeated the lies. She began to understand how fear worked, how belief could be shaped, how a story could kill faster than poison. Despenser had taught her the art of propaganda. He just didn't realize she was learning. As the years dragged on, England itself began to rot from within. Famine spread. War with Scotland drained the treasury. The nobles despised the Despensers, and the people hated the crown. Edward, lost in his obsession, confiscated lands, executed rivals, and trusted only those who flattered him. The king was blind, the country broke, and the queen was a prisoner in her own castle. She was denied access to her children. Her servants were spies. Her letters intercepted. Even the chapel where she prayed had eyes and ears. They thought they had broken her. But while Edward and Despenser ruled through fear, Isabella was learning patience. The patience of a wolf waiting for the right moment to strike. By 1320, the rumors about her had become folklore. In taverns, peasants told stories of the she-wolf of France, the queen who danced with devils and turned into a beast beneath the full moon. Children whispered her name as a curse. It should have destroyed her. Instead, it immortalized her. Because a monster, once named, can choose how to use its legend. The people began to see something else in her, not a witch, but a woman wronged. A foreign queen exiled in her own court, standing tall while men whispered filth. To the hungry, the powerless, she became an image of endurance. She had been called a beast, yet she still walked like a queen. Then came the war. In 1324, tensions between England and France exploded into open conflict. Gascony, a patch of land in southwestern France, became the spark that reignited centuries of rivalry. Edward panicked. He needed a diplomat to negotiate peace with the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's own brother. The irony was perfect. Send the hated wife away, and if the peace failed, blame her. Despenser thought he was ridding himself of his greatest problem. In truth, he had just opened the door to his own destruction. When Isabella crossed the Channel in March 1325, she left England as a humiliated queen and arrived in France as royal blood returned home. The French court welcomed her with ceremony, and for the first time in years, she was treated with respect, not as a rumor, but as a ruler's daughter. The air of Paris was different. Here, she was not the she-wolf. She was the princess of France. She quickly proved her political acumen. Instead of negotiating directly for Edward, she suggested a compromise, that their 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, should travel to France to pay homage to King Charles on his father's behalf. It sounded like loyalty, but it was strategy. Once the young prince set foot in Paris, he would be beyond Despenser's reach. When the plan succeeded, Isabella had everything she needed: legitimacy, allies, and most importantly, the future King of England under her protection. Letters from Edward II arrived soon after. They were commands at first, then pleas. "Return to me," he wrote. "Your duty is to your husband." But Isabella's reply was legendary. "I will not return," she said, "while the wolf remains in the fold." With one line, she turned the narrative on its head. For years, they had called her the wolf. Now she cast Despenser as the real beast corrupting England. It was poetic justice. The rumor devoured its master. From the palaces of Paris, Isabella began to weave the threads of her revenge. She met with exiled English lords who had fled Despenser's tyranny. She charmed the French nobility, secured funding, and slowly built an army not of numbers, but of allegiance. And then, among those exiles, she met one man who would change everything, Roger Mortimer. A seasoned warrior, disgraced, ambitious, and angry. He saw in Isabella not a victim, but a partner. Together, they would ignite a rebellion that would bring down a king. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, imagine this. A girl once traded like a coin, silenced by scandal, burned by rumor, now standing on a Parisian balcony, the flags of France flapping above her. Behind her, her young son, the heir to England's throne. Before her, the country that once called her a monster. The world had tried to bury Isabella of France beneath its lies. Instead, it had sharpened her teeth, and the she-wolf was about to bite back. Paris, spring of 1325. For the first time in years, Isabella could breathe. The gray skies of England were behind her, replaced by the gilded light of her homeland. The French court, elegant, glittering, alive with music, received her not as a disgraced wife, but as a princess returned. The rumors that had poisoned her name in London carried little weight here. In France, she was no she-wolf. She was the daughter of Philip the Fair, and even her brother, King Charles IV, treated her with cautious respect. But behind her calm smile, Isabella was calculating. She had not come to Paris for comfort. She had come for leverage, and she found it in the perfect form, her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, the boy who would one day be king. With her persuasion, Charles agreed to summon him to France to pay homage for his father's English territories. Edward II, desperate to restore peace, had no choice but to send the boy. When the young prince set foot in Paris that September, Isabella knew the game had changed. She now held the future of England, literally, in her hands. For months, she remained silent. She made no sudden moves, no proclamations. Instead, she rebuilt her image carefully, step by step. She attended Mass daily, dressed in modest French silks instead of English jewels, and presented herself as the faithful mother seeking nothing more than peace for her child. People began to forget the scandals whispered years ago. The she-wolf was vanishing. In her place stood a mother, calm and regal, with eyes that missed nothing. Then came the letters, from Edward II, across the channel. At first polite, then pleading, then furious. He ordered her to return, accused her of betrayal, even threatened her with excommunication. But Isabella refused. Her reply was ice-cold and unforgettable. "I will not return while the wolf remains in the fold." That single line cut through England like a blade. For years, she had been called the wolf. Now she used the metaphor as a mirror. The true predator was Hugh Despenser. The phrase spread faster than any rumor Despenser had ever crafted. In taverns, lords repeated it in hushed voices. The queen had spoken, and she was no longer afraid. In the French court, she began to gather allies. Exiled English nobles who had fled Despenser's brutality. Men whose lands had been stolen, families executed, reputations destroyed. One of them was Roger Mortimer, once a powerful baron of the Welsh Marches. He had escaped from the Tower of London, fled across the sea, and nursed his hatred like a wound. When Isabella met him, it wasn't in the glow of romance, but in the cold recognition of shared purpose. Two outcasts with one goal, the destruction of Hugh Despenser and the redemption of England. They spoke in shadows, over maps, over letters from sympathetic lords, over the faint crackle of firelight. Mortimer, seasoned in warfare, knew how to raise troops. Isabella, trained in diplomacy, knew how to raise legitimacy. Together, they began to weave a plan that would have seemed impossible months before, an armed invasion of England led not by a rival king, but by its queen. By winter 1325, the rumors of their partnership reached England. Predictably, Edward II exploded in fury. He stripped Isabella of her royal titles, seized her lands, and declared her an enemy of the crown. But it was already too late. Each punishment only strengthened her cause. Every act of cruelty painted her as a victim of tyranny and Despenser as the true villain. Through 1326, Isabella's alliances grew. France offered quiet support. Flemish merchants, angry at England's trade policies, supplied ships and silver. Disillusioned English nobles sent word that they would rise if she landed. Isabella and Mortimer, now openly lovers, moved their base of operations to Hainaut, a duchy near the northern coast. There, they negotiated with Count William for troops in exchange for a marriage alliance. Isabella's son would wed his daughter. It was a masterstroke. Love is politics. Politics is war. By September, everything was ready. A fleet of ships waited at the Flemish coast, loaded with mercenaries, gold, and weapons. At their head stood a woman once mocked as a monster. Her armor was light, but her resolve unbreakable. As dawn broke on September 24th, 1326, Isabella gave the order to England. The sea was rough, but fate was kind. When her small army landed at Suffolk, they expected resistance, perhaps even annihilation. Instead, they were met with open arms. Word had traveled fast. The Queen had returned. Peasants came bearing bread and wine. Towns opened their gates. Banners that once flew for the king were lowered in silence. In a matter of days, Isabella's army swelled. The great lords of England, Lancaster, Norfolk, Kent, defected one by one. They were tired of Despenser's tyranny, tired of Edward's weakness. But what shocked them most was the Queen herself. She did not hide behind soldiers or priests. She rode among them, armored and unflinching, her young son by her side. To see her, alive, commanding, motherly yet fierce, shattered years of propaganda. The she-wolf was not a creature of sin. She was human, and she had come home. Edward II panicked. Abandoning London, he fled west with Hugh Despenser, hoping to rally loyalists in Wales. It was a fatal mistake. Each mile they retreated, they lost followers. The nobles realized the king no longer ruled. He merely ran. The capital erupted. Londoners stormed the homes of Despenser's allies, freed prisoners, and declared loyalty to the Queen. Churches rang their bells not for the king's safety, but for his downfall. By October, Isabella's forces marched through England almost unopposed. In every town she entered, she restored local rights, punished Despenser's men, and paid for supplies, small gestures. But they transformed her image completely. To the people, she was not an invader, she was deliverance. On October 2nd, 1326, Isabella entered London to thunderous applause. The streets were flooded with flowers. The same crowds that had once whispered about her unnatural sins now called her Our Lady Queen of Mercy. She had rewritten her legend in less than a month. But her victory was not complete while Despenser lived. Edward's favorite, the man who had turned her life into a nightmare, was still out there, fleeing through the Welsh countryside. Isabella placed a bounty on his head, £1,000 for the king, 500 for Despenser. The amounts were staggering, the message unmistakable. No one in England was worth more dead. Within weeks, both fugitives were captured. Despenser's father was executed first, publicly, as a symbol. But Isabella saved her true vengeance for Hugh the Younger. Chronicles describe the trial as swift: treason, theft, perversion, cruelty. He was sentenced to die by hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. Isabella watched from a distance. There were no tears, no outburst, just the quiet satisfaction of a debt being repaid. The man who had dehumanized her was now the one reduced to dust. Edward II was slower. Captured near Lantricent, he was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in January 1327. The ceremony was pure theater. The hall was draped in royal colors. Isabella stood beside her son, Edward III, tall and composed, while her husband, the once king, appeared in black, as if mourning himself. When he surrendered the crown to their child, the audience cheered. It was the ultimate act of poetic justice. The woman once branded a beast now stood as the mother of England's new king. For a moment, peace seemed possible. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents for the young Edward III. England was stable again, the nobles content, the treasury full. But power has its own gravity, and Isabella had spent too many years clawing her way to the top to step aside easily. She and Mortimer began to live like royalty. Feasts, titles, gold flowing into their hands. The same whispers that once destroyed her began to echo again. Pride, arrogance, corruption. History has a cruel sense of irony. And then, one autumn morning in 1327, the whispers turned once more toward death. Edward II, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, was found dead. Officially, it was natural causes. Unofficially, something else. The story said he was murdered by a red-hot iron thrust into his body, leaving no marks, only screams. Was it true? Historians still argue. But even in rumor, the message was clear: poetic vengeance, an answer to years of humiliation. Whether Isabella ordered it or not, the world believed she had. And for a while, that belief served her. She was no longer the victim. She was the queen who had toppled a king, avenged her name, and rewritten the rules of medieval politics. France admired her. England feared her. And the legend of the she-wolf, once an insult, became her crown. But time is relentless, and so are sons. Edward III grew older, sharper, restless under the shadow of his mother and her lover. He had watched their games, learned their lessons, and now wanted his own throne, clean of theirs. By 1330, the tide had turned. Mortimer was executed, Isabella stripped of power, confined to a quiet life in the countryside. No more armies, no more courts, no more whispers. Just silence. Yet even in silence, her legend endured. The chronicles called her dangerous, brilliant, vengeful. Some wrote that she died raving, haunted by ghosts of the men she'd destroyed. Others claimed she died peacefully, surrounded by prayers and relics. But every version ended with the same truth. Isabella of France had done what no queen before her dared. She fought a world built to silence her, and she won. History would remember her by the name her enemies gave her, the she-wolf of France. But maybe that was fitting. After all, wolves don't ask permission to survive. The castle walls were quiet now. No banners fluttered, no horns announced her name. Once, Isabella of France had ruled nations, bent kings to her will, and watched her enemies hang beneath gray English skies. Now, she woke to the sound of crows and the echo of her own thoughts. Power, it turned out, was never a throne, it was alone. It had been 3 years since the coronation of her son, Edward III. He was 17 now, tall, sharp-eyed, his father's height, but his mother's poise. The boy she'd once shielded in Paris had become a man, and the man was watching her. Every move she made, every decision Roger Mortimer whispered into her ear, the young king studied it all in silence. Isabella told herself it was love that guided her, that she was protecting his crown until he was ready. But love had long since tangled itself with ambition. After all she had endured, betrayal, exile, humiliation, how could she simply fade into the background? She had ruled England once, and part of her believed she still should. The partnership with Mortimer had changed everything. Once her ally, now her equal, he walked through palaces as though he wore an invisible crown. The same courtiers who had bowed to her now bowed to him. He issued decrees in the king's name, collected taxes, appointed judges. Edward III's face was on the coins, but Mortimer's shadow was on the throne. At first, the queen turned a blind eye. Mortimer had been her sword and shield, her confidant, the man who had risked everything for her cause. But as weeks turned into months, his arrogance grew. He dressed in gold-trimmed robes, hosted feasts that rivaled coronations, even had nobles address him as "my Lord Governor." The whispers began again, the kind of whispers Isabella once used as weapons. England has 2 rulers, people murmured in taverns. One wears a crown, the other shares the queen's bed. It was a cruel echo of the past. Once, they had mocked her husband for the same sin, a favorite more powerful than the monarch. Isabella had dethroned a king for that. Now, she was repeating his story. At court, young Edward listened. He saw his mother transformed from the fierce lioness of rebellion into a queen cloaked in indulgence. He saw the fear Mortimer inspired, the executions he ordered without trial, the fortunes confiscated from noble houses. And he began to see himself not as a son under his mother's protection, but as a king held hostage. The turning point came in 1330. England was restless again, taxes high, resentment simmering. Isabella and Mortimer planned a lavish autumn council at Nottingham Castle to reaffirm their control. The young king attended, silent but watching. To everyone else, he looked obedient, almost docile. To those who looked closer, his calm had weight, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. That night, as candles burned low, a handful of loyal knights crept through a hidden tunnel beneath the castle. The passage was ancient, built for escape during siege, its entrance known only to the king's inner guard. At its end lay Mortimer's chamber. Isabella slept in the adjoining room. The door burst open. Swords flashed. Mortimer, half-dressed, reached for a dagger but found no chance to use it. "Treason," he shouted. "You dare lay hands on your queen's command?" But from the doorway came a voice colder than winter. "It is not the queen's command," said Edward III. "It is the king's." In that moment, the balance of power shattered. Mortimer was seized, his men disarmed, his wealth confiscated. Isabella ran into the corridor, her robe trailing behind her, hair loose, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in decades, she wasn't the hunter, she was the hunted. She begged her son for mercy, her voice trembling with something between fear and maternal pride. "He is loyal to me," she said. "All that he has done was done for you." But Edward's answer was firm. "Then he has done enough." Mortimer was taken to London, tried for treason, and executed at Tyburn without ceremony. No grand speeches, no last words. The man who once ruled through fear died in silence. Isabella was not executed, but her punishment was sharper: confinement and obscurity. For the rest of her life, she lived in a kind of gilded exile, first in Castle Rising, later at various estates across England. She was treated with respect, given a generous allowance, but forbidden from politics. To the world, she was still the Queen Mother. To herself, she was a ghost wandering the ruins of her own legend. Years passed quietly. The wars her son waged, against Scotland, against France, echoed faintly through the halls where she embroidered and prayed. Sometimes, when she walked through the gardens, she could still hear the voices of the past, the cheers in London, the cries at the gallows, the whisper of "She-Wolf," carried by the wind. They said she spent her final years repenting, that she wore a gray habit instead of jewels, attended Mass daily, and kept a small silver crucifix by her bed. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was strategy, one last effort to let history remember her not as the monster of rumor, but as a queen wronged by fate. In 1358, Isabella of France died at Castle Rising, aged 63. The chronicles disagree on her last words, but one account says that as she lay dying, she asked to be buried with the mantle she had worn at her wedding, the same mantle Edward II once draped over Piers Gaveston. If it was true, it was a strange kind of poetry, a woman who had been betrayed, humiliated, and crowned twice over choosing to leave the world wrapped in the memory of her first defeat. Her tomb, at Greyfriars in London, bore a simple inscription: "Here lies Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of England." Nothing more. No mention of rebellion, of conquest, of scandal. Just a name and a title. But history rarely stays silent. The chroniclers couldn't resist resurrecting her legend. Some painted her as a hero, the avenger of England, the mother who saved her son's throne. Others damned her as the serpent in silk, the femme fatale who destroyed one king and ruled through another. And in time, poets and playwrights would take her story and twist it again, until truth and myth were indistinguishable. Yet behind every version lies the same haunting reality. Isabella of France was never meant to rule. The world she was born into allowed women to adorn thrones, not occupy them. She was supposed to be silent, obedient, ornamental. Instead, she learned to wield silence as a weapon, obedience as a mask, beauty as camouflage. She turned rumor into armor and fear into fire. And yes, she made enemies. She killed, she lied, she manipulated. But she also survived in a world where survival itself was rebellion. Centuries later, historians still argue, was she a villain or a visionary? Did she murder her husband or simply outlive him? Was she the she-wolf of France, or just a woman forced to grow fangs to stay alive? Maybe the answer is simpler. Maybe she was both. Because Isabella's life was the story of power in its purest form, not noble, not evil, just human. power that seduces, corrupts, and consumes everyone who touches it. Her rise was built on rumor, her fall on silence. And somewhere between those two lies the truth. A young girl sent as a pawn who became a queen who became a myth, and a myth that outlived them all. Even now, more than 700 years later, her shadow lingers in the folds of English history. Every time a woman in power is called ambitious, dangerous, untrustworthy, some echo of Isabella's legend stirs again. The story of the she-wolf is not just about one queen's vengeance. It's about the fear she represented, the fear of a woman who refused to play by the rules men wrote for her. And perhaps that's why her story still matters. Because in the end, the she-wolf didn't fall. She simply disappeared into the forest of history, unseen, but always listening. Centuries have passed since Isabella of France walked this earth, yet her shadow still drifts through the corridors of history. Her name survives not in marble statues or holy relics, but in the stories people continue to tell, stories of power, betrayal, and survival. Every generation seems to rediscover her, to dress her legend in new words, new fears, new desires. To some, she is still the she-wolf, cunning, ruthless, dangerous. To others, she is a feminist before the word existed, a woman who refused to accept the boundaries her world imposed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between myth and memory. Medieval chroniclers were the first to shape her legacy. Men who feared her influence painted her in the colors of sin. They wrote of enchantments and lust, of a queen who devoured her lovers and poisoned her king. For them, a woman who acted with authority was unnatural. Therefore, she must also be unholy. In their ink, ambition became evil, and strategy became witchcraft. Those words stain the pages of history for centuries. But time has a way of rewriting its own stories. When the Renaissance arrived, scholars began to look back at Isabella with curiosity rather than condemnation. They saw a woman who had navigated an impossible world, a foreign queen in a hostile land, and had not only survived, but seized control of her destiny. By the Enlightenment, her rebellion against tyranny was being studied as politics, not madness. And in modern times, historians have peeled back the layers of propaganda to find a human being underneath. The she-wolf, they discovered, was never a monster. She was a mirror, reflecting the fears of the men who tried to define her. Today, her image appears everywhere, in novels, on stage, in film and television. Sometimes she is a tragic heroine, sometimes a seductive villain. In one version, she weeps for the husband she destroyed. In another, she smiles as England burns. Each portrayal says less about Isabella and more about us, about how each era imagines female power. What makes her story endure isn't the scandal or the bloodshed. It's the paradox. How could a woman branded as sinful become the symbol of resilience? How could a legend born from lies become the foundation of truth? Isabella's life reminds us that history isn't written by heroes or villains, it's written by survivors. Every accusation thrown at her, witch, adulteress, beast, was meant to cage her. Instead, she turned those cages into weapons. She learned that if the world insists on calling you a monster, the most dangerous thing you can do is learn to roar. Even now, her echo reaches into the present. When women in power are described as too ambitious, too emotional, too cold, it's the same vocabulary once used against a queen who dared to rule. Isabella's story becomes a warning and a challenge to look deeper, to question who benefits when a woman's strength is turned into her curse. In the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of the she-wolf. Not her revenge, not her downfall, but her defiance, the quiet, relentless refusal to be defined by others. She reminds us that history may twist your name, but it cannot erase your impact. So when we hear her legend, whispered through centuries of ink and rumor, we should listen carefully. Beneath the noise, there's still the heartbeat of a girl from Paris, sent away at 13 to marry a stranger. A girl who learned that survival, in a world built to break her, was the most radical act of all. The she-wolf did not vanish in her fall. She simply changed form, becoming the story itself. And as long as people tell it, she will never truly die. History remembers her as a monster. Perhaps it was safer that way. If you've made it this far, you've walked beside one of the most misunderstood women in medieval Europe. A queen made of fire, forged by rumor, remembered in legend. Don't forget, every story we inherit carries a shadow. And sometimes, the shadow tells the truth.